and welcome to this week's webinar. I'm going to go through understanding your pelvis and understanding your pelvic position. Now this one, I say maybe slightly shorter than some of the others. I'm going to be as concise as I can with it because it's pretty much a bit of science, a bit of positioning, and then I'll show you some kind of movements stood up, and then if you want me to send you any movements in different mobility positions, I will send them as a follow-up. So when it comes to understanding our pelvis, we've got three positions, generally speaking, that our pelvis is going to sit in. That's going to be neutral, in an anterior tilt or forwards, and in a posterior tilt backwards. So whenever I'm talking about anterior, I'm meaning forwards of that central line. So forwards of the midline, forwards of our centre of mass. Posterior is behind our centre of mass, anything that is tilting away from the midline. Now, ideally speaking, our pelvis, this is us front on, and this is us side on. Our pelvis should give us a position where that midline stays obviously straight through the centre. We can go straight through our pubis and kind of the middle of our pubic bones, our iliums and our iliac crest of the pelvis. We can go straight through the middle of that and get an even cut left, right, front and back. And that is kind of how our pelvis should sit, and it should allow us to kind of have that cross section at any point. It's important to understand that we need the pelvis to sometimes manipulate into slightly different positions when training, but when under load, we're always searching for that neutral spine, that neutral position where we can kick in our spinal erectors, our big spinal muscles, our transverse abdominis, so the core muscles that go across the body, our obliques, the core muscles through our ribcage and down our sides, and our abdominals, i.e. the six-pack muscles on the front. So we want this whole core and this trunk to work in one to make sure that this pelvis stays as a perfect triangle. Now what you'll see when it comes to the anterior tilt of the pelvis has tilted forwards. And what that looks like, because it might feel like it's going backwards, but it's that duck-like position. So from neutral, it's the iliac crest, so the crest of your pelvis that you can put around your hands around, dropping forwards, rotating into this position. We've got this duck-like position, bums out to the back, head is now forwards of the midline, and we've got loads of pressure coming in that lower back. So the pelvis crest is tipped forwards, my triangle, here's my iliac crest, it's moved forwards. Anterior tilt of the pelvis. Now what that's going to kind of come from, funnily enough, both of these tilts generally come from similar things, and a lot of it has to do with our lifestyle now. So lots of sitting, perhaps muscular imbalances, weak core, tight hip flexors, tight hamstrings, tight lower back, inactive glutes. That's pretty much the same list across both sides. What happens with the anterior tilt is we put a hell of a lot of pressure on because if I can add that curve a little bit more, the lower back, okay, into that lumbar. There's loads of pressure coming into here as we've got kind of a joint that isn't sitting where it should sit. Okay, so the pelvis is tilted forwards, iliac crest has moved forwards, we've got loads of lumbar pressure, we've got tight hips that are pulling that pelvis down, pulling that rib cage, pulling that pelvis into a position we don't want it to be. We've got tight lower back. Now, it is important to add that at some points it can obviously be structural or genetic, and there is certain things we can do about that, but what I'm going to kind of talk about in terms of understanding your pelvis and the position is lifestyle kind of factors today, because that's what will affect kind of each of you. So we've got that duck-like position, we've got loads of pressure on our lower back, and that's come forwards. When we're doing things like a squat, for example, and we get that anterior tilt, you can hopefully see it in my drawing here. Here's our barbell, pelvis has shifted forwards, we're trying to squat, and we've got this really loads of pressure, we can hardly move, big curve through the back, and we've just dropped that pelvis too far in. We've hit that curve through the lumbar, loads of pressure, and we're just not being able to manipulate. So coming back to standing, it can be a challenge, but in standing, if you've got a good understanding of your pelvis, you should be able to manipulate it with a little bit of kind of a tilt and press of the thumb through anterior, posterior, anterior, posterior, neutral. And it's making sure that when we're finding neutral, we can stay in that position, tighten the core around it, and sit into our squat, not allowing that pelvis to drop forwards or to collapse into posterior, and we're trying to come down here and we look like a big mashed potato, back's rounding, it's kyphotic, and we're in a bad position. So coming across to posterior, pretty much the same thing happens the opposite direction. So we've tilted forwards, then the iliac crest has gone backwards. Straight away, you can see the rounding and the kyphosis of my back. Here, it's rounded. I've got this kind of flat bit here that I shouldn't naturally have. I should have a slight curve. Rounded through into kyphosis, which is generally the thoracic rounding. Shoulders come forwards. Funnily enough, tight hips, inactive glutes, tight hamstrings, tight lower back. Again, we're going to get those same kind of mitigating factors, shall we call it that? Or same causation of both, but we can get either effect. Ilium moves backwards, ilium moves forwards, anterior, posterior. Tucked bottom, hips are closed, and we're into that kyphos. So naturally, some people are more kyphotic, they're more rounded through the thoracic. Some people can benefit from work on the chest that's tight, the upper back that's stretched to pull those shoulders back into position. Sometimes what we find in pulling the shoulders, we start to manipulate the pelvis because everything's on a kinetic chain. So we've got anterior tilt, posterior tilt. Generally speaking, lifestyle factors of sitting too long, mobility being poor, core not being switched on, can lead to either. And most of us, including myself, will have trained and fallen into one of these positions, neutral, anterior or posterior, but specifically these two, even just slightly. Sometimes you're like, oh, I just feel a little bit out of position. And it just might be literally like 10%, just shifting things around, loosening off hamstrings, loosening off hips, going onto the floor and going through cat and cow. So when we're in that cat and cow position, what we're doing as we come through into that cow position, we're pronouncing our bum, we are stretching, putting that lumbar under a little bit of tension, we're dropping that pelvis forwards, we're going purposely into anterior so that we can understand. Pelvic understanding in positional drills is key, so that we can understand that we can manipulate that pelvis into neutral and then real big push into that angry cat, thoracic shoots up and we go into that posterior tilt. And when it comes to things like plank, for example, it's a big one that I see when we put somebody in a plank position, and what you get is there. I'll make that more curved. There, okay, so that's our plank. Pelvis has dropped forwards. Not done that triangle particularly well, but pelvis has dropped forwards into here, and we've got that arcing in that lower back, okay? And what we want to be able to do is to send the pelvis completely neutral so that we can have the back, there's maybe even a slight flattening, so we're kind of creeping towards posterior, but we're holding here versus letting this iliac crest drop in, and that immediately causes this curvature in here. So then we're inactive in position. We're not strengthening our core, it's just sat in a lengthened position, it's pretty much off. All the load sits on our lower back, so our lower back's going to get tighter, hips are stretched, so they're going to get tighter. Muscular imbalance, we're all over the show because we're not working the muscles that we want to use. And what we're doing is we're reinforcing that pelvic understanding that we don't want. Okay, so going through cat and cow as a warm-up drill, making sure that we're thinking, anterior tilt, I now know what that feels like. Tucking under, posterior tilt, okay, I now know what that looks like. When might I want to shift my pelvis slightly posteriorly? In a dead bug, I'm asking you to feel the floor through your lower back. I'm asking you to shift that pelvis back, get that lower back pinned onto the floor so that we can isolate the trunk and work that core through those dead bug positions. Because if we're not forcing it down into that slight posterior position and we let it loosen off, what happens when we're in dead bug? Here's my floor, I'm flat on the back, extending arms and legs. If I loosen off that position of forcing that pelvis into that posterior tilt and I relax, we get an over-pronounced arch as we're dropping our legs super low. We're then sitting, opening up, stretching, and we're actually not controlling the pelvis in any way, shape or form. At worst, we want a slight lift, but holding neutral, okay, in things like dead bugs, and making sure in things like planks. I'd much rather you have a slight kyphotic position, i.e. upper back slightly rounded in a plank, but pelvis neutral / slightly posterior, than dropping through anterior and loading that lumbar, okay? Because that's what we don't want. So when it comes to understanding your pelvic position, my top drills are cat and cow, standing also, and just getting your thumb behind your iliac crest, which is like the big crest of your pelvis, 2 fingers in front of your hips, and just feeling it come forwards and backwards, and finding where your neutral is. We can do that standing, we can do that against a wall, flattening into the wall, curving away. Cat and cow on all fours, we can do that there. So when it comes to drills like dead bugs and planks, and I'm saying tuck that pelvis, push that belly button up to the sky, we've got those triggers of we're going through neutral, we're looking to maybe dip into this one to keep safe in certain core drills, but we're looking to avoid this one at all costs, and avoiding this one when we're doing things like standing, walking, squatting, etc, etc. It's all about the holy grail of getting your pelvis to sit so that at any cross-sectional dissection of yourself, we're exactly half and half. And the pelvis is key because that's what links the power of the lower body through the spine into the support structure of the core and the upper body. If we start losing that pelvis and losing that core here, all of this here and all of this here, pardon my French, pretty much starts to go to shit. Really does. I cannot stress the importance of understanding what an anterior tilt feels like, what a posterior tilt feels like, when you, avoiding this, when you can utilize this to support your core, and what this neutral position feels like, your natural curve, your happy place, making sure that at all points we're working on the shoulders, the chest and the upper back as well, so that when it comes to doing things like our squats, whether our load is here or here, we're super safe. If you've got any questions on the pelvis, or you want me to do any demos of further drills, please do let me know. But keep in mind now going forwards, there's a reason cat and cow sits in mobility, and when it comes to things like dead bugs, anything on the floor where we're trying to put that back flat against the floor to isolate the core, specifically the abdominals, to do the load, it's in order to support everything from kicking out and switching off and going into that anterior tilt. Hope that helps, guys, and I'll be back again.